transient hotels with male hippies, and finally taken to begging with the other young homeless on the streets of the East Village to support her drug habit. I didn't even know there was an East Village, her distraught father told a New York Times reporter who pieced together her dual existences. I've heard of the Lower East Side, but the East Village? Now, I know there's not a ton of music in that section. There's a little bit more in the next section. I kind of like reading from parts that can flow a little better without getting too sidetracked into record releases and so on. This one kind of follows on in a natural way, and then we'll have our discussion. This is the opening part of the chapter called The Apple Stretching. It's the next chapter, and this should be self-explanatory. Homosexuality was not illegal in New York City in the 1960s. It just seemed that way. The New York State Liquor Authority had long insisted that merely by serving drinks to homosexuals, a bar was maintaining a disorderly house, which the SLA could, and often did, then close. It embarked upon a particularly aggressive series of such license revocations from 1959 through the mid-1960s. Only in 1967, after constant agitation by a handful of openly gay campaigners, were New York bars allowed to knowingly serve homosexuals without prosecution. When, the next year, a state judge decreed that same-sex couples dancing together were not breaking the law, it may have seemed that the tide was finally turning. Yet the New York Police Department continued to enforce an arcane and degrading law that required people to wear at least 3 items of gender-specific clothing in public. In addition, the police policy of entrapment extended beyond the solicitation of gay prostitutes on the street and frequently involved the arrest of young men on the dance floor. This discrimination and victimization did not deter gay nightlife. Rather, it sent its potentially lucrative customers into the clutches of the people who knew how best to profit from it, the mafia. In Greenwich Village, always Manhattan's prime gay neighborhood, the scene's clubs and bars were divided almost equally between the Gambino family and the Genovese family. Few of their venues ever had all the correct licenses, but the police were known to turn a blind eye in exchange for regular payoffs. To keep up appearances, the 6th Precinct would occasionally launch token raids, typically tipping off the club owners in advance. After the routine demanding of ID and a bout of homophobic name-calling, the police would leave, and the bar club would resume its activities. Neither the police nor the club owners ever expected the patrons to protest. Where else, after all, were queers, faggots, or fairies, as they were most commonly referred to in public, permitted to flaunt their lifestyle? Of these various village bars, the Stonewall Inn on Christopher Street, almost from its opening night in March 1967, proved the most prominent. An insalubrious double storefront, the Stonewall's windows were painted black and boarded on the inside, and its decor consisted simply of 2 connected rooms, each with a dance floor and a bar, one with the bonus of a few booths. The Stonewall clientele, according to one of its regular customers, Wayne Rogers, later to become Jane County, who had frequented the club since arriving in the city from Atlanta in 1967, included drag queens, hippie queens with long hair down to their shoulders, butch lesbians in men's shirts, and a few straight people. Also in the mix were teenagers, blacks, Puerto Ricans, and whites alike, who fell under the late 60s terminology of flame queens, favoring body-hugging male clothing with teased hair and eye makeup, and who attracted chicken hawks, older gays out to seduce them. Ostensibly a members-only club, one of the means by which the mob could circumvent SLA requirements, the Stonewall's customers would typically sign in under idolized names such as Judy Garland, Diana Ross, and Joey D. Once inside, they were encouraged to head straight to the bar, where drinks were watered down and glasses refilled with only a cursory rinse in a dirty vat, there being no running water behind the bar. Stolen goods, drugs, and sex were all readily traded under the watchful eye of Ed the Skull Murphy, a career criminal and veteran gay club manager who also oversaw activities at the nearby juice bar, the 10th of Always, where the clientele was yet younger. In brackets, the drinking age in New York at the time was 18. Being alcohol-free, the 10th of Always could let in those even younger. Well known for his own fondness for chicken, Murphy was embroiled in various prostitution rings and alleged to be behind the permanent disappearance of at least one of the young Stonewall regulars. Despite all this, the Stonewall afforded a certain degree of shelter, especially for the homeless kids who slept in Christopher Square across the street. And many of the young gays admitted that the seediness of the place added to its attraction. But what really distinguished the Stonewall was the freedom to dance without harassment, something not found in other gay village bars. The Stonewall's twin dance floors were fed by a jukebox, And in June 1969, when the club was subjected to a police raid that would have major repercussions on gay nights and dance music alike, that jukebox was stocked in equal part by Motown, The Young Folks by Diana Ross, contemporary hippie hits, Aquarius, Let the Sun Shine In from Hair, dramatic camp, In the Ghetto by Elvis Presley, girl groups, You Came, You Saw, You Conquered by the Ronettes, and straight-up dance instrumentals like Grazing in the Grass by Friends of Distinction. There were several reasons why the raid early on Saturday, June 28th proved atypical. For one, it was a ferociously hot midsummer's night on which a full moon rode high in the sky. For another, it was already 1:20 a.m. when the music was halted, peak hour for New York's weekend revelers, when hormones are typically raging and grievances well fueled by drink and drugs. In addition, it was the second raid on the club in 4 nights, the 6th Precinct having apparently made one of its token incursions earlier in the week. The funeral of the gay icon Judy Garland had taken place in Manhattan earlier that day, some 22,000 people filing past her coffin in just 24 hours, adding to the foreboding atmosphere. And the raid itself was far from routine, having been launched by detectives of the 1st Division, a higher authority. We knew the 6th Precinct wasn't very effective in keeping those bars properly controlled, the raid's leading detective, Deputy Inspector Seymour Pine, said years later. We didn't tell them we were going to raid the bar. Only once inside the club, having halted the music and seized the cash registers, did the officers call the local precinct for backup. The detectives then began inspecting IDs and checking gender. At least 3 drag queens and 1 particularly butch lesbian was arrested for cross-dressing. The others were released slowly, one by one, onto the street outside, where the atmosphere turned into something between a carnival and a protest. When the butch lesbian, a passing woman by other terminology, was placed inside one of the 6th Precinct's police cars, she delighted onlookers by proudly exiting from the other door. When bodily handled back into the car, she fought back physically. That was the moment, said Jim Fouratt, the hippie gay activist who avoided the Stonewall for its chicken hawk reputation, but found himself walking down Christopher Street that night on his way home from Max's Kansas City. That was the flashpoint when people suddenly became conscious that they had power. So now I write a little more about the events of that night, and then that leads into it leads into the emergence of the loft parties and the the disco scene in New York. But I thought that was a good place for us to introduce Jim, and can we have a round of applause for Jim? Thank you. And Jim, why don't you introduce yourself more thoroughly than that, because you were in New York long before even these chapters, correct?
Well, I came to New York in 1960. And in Tony's book is a wonderful kaleidoscope of many multiple things happening in the same decade, the 60s. It also goes into the 70s. It goes back to 1927. But it's almost like you could be in multiple personalities if you live through the 60s. And when someone writes about you as a Stonewall person, they're not talking about the Cafe Au Go-Go that was going on at the same time, or all the other things that were going on that was a part of my life also. And the wonderful thing about this book is really about pop culture. And it's written in a way that you and I can read it without having a PhD in symbiotics, which is really, I'm so grateful for that, Tony, that it's a very readable, authentic book. That said, I'd like to correct a couple of the things that you've read. I saw you
taking notes.
First of all, I mean, you know, the Stonewall is only 40 years ago, but the mythology around Stonewall is enormous, and the actual event has been lost in what actually happened. Number one, I would never call it a riot, because a riot has very specific characteristics that take place. And I've been in riots in a political sense, and that was not what happened to Stonewall. It was, in my view, a rebellion. Some people call it an uprising. It's when, at the end of the 60s, a specific group of people, the gay and lesbian population, got in touch with that their time had come. It was the end of other people, other minority groups in the 60s, and it was a very empowering. Riots are people out of control, being very destructive, and usually who gets hurt is the actual people that riot. As Tony said, there were very few people arrested that night, so there were no, you check the hospital records. You'll hear a lot of mythology about, I beat up a cop, I did this, I did that. And I always take a breath and say, okay, people want to remember it that way because it was so significant in their lives. But in fact, it diminishes what actually did happen, which is that people finally felt a sense of power within themselves. That soundtrack, that jukebox in the Stonewall,